Now, across Texas, the issue is.
I'm Stephen Dial in Dallas.
And I'm Greg Grugan in Houston. And this is Texas, the issue is.
There is a bipartisan bill in the Texas House that would ban all cell phones in public school classrooms. I spoke to State Representative Caroline Fairley about the bill.
We have heard from so many teachers who have said, we need the state to kind of have our back on this issue because we're in the classroom picking up phones and ending up, being the bad guy when it comes to this policy.
Why do you think it's so important to restrict cell phone access in the classroom?
There's really three critical issues that are really important when you look at this piece of legislation. First is the student academic outcome. Second is the mental health aspect. And then third is classroom management for our teachers. And so when you look at all of those, across the board, we are targeting being sure that our kids go to school to focus on academics, but we also protect them. The amount of cyberbullying that's being cited in these schools is gone up so much more.
Some North Texas school districts have implemented or are testing out a cell phone ban. How can the enforcement happen if this becomes law?
We've been really careful with our legislation to allow for as much local control as possible. I think it's really important to address this. And so you're right, about 25 school districts, to my knowledge, have already started implementing this, and they're seeing test scores increase. They're seeing student interactions with the teachers and even other peers is going way better than it was before. But when you talk about enforcement, the reality is we've allowed in the bill to for the school to adopt their own disciplinary policy. And so again, it's back to local control. Like, we want the school districts to make the best disciplinary policy they see fit.
I know it's a rare word in Austin, bipartisan. This bill has bipartisan support, right? Kind of just talk about why so many lawmakers are saying, hey, we're at a point where this is something that's needed.
When you talk about policy and even politics in Texas, we tend to sometimes see polarization on two different sides. And there's a lot of middle ground policy that both parties agree on. And I'm encouraged that this is one of them. And so, we have a wide variety of members who have joint authored this bill. And I think it's because on both sides, both parties are realizing whether it's the mental health component, whether it's the classroom management, the teachers need support from the state, and also student academic outcomes. Like, both parties agree, I think, for the most part, that we want our kids to have the best education in Texas. The 5.5 million kids we have in Texas, we want it to be good.
What would your pushback be to a parent who says, I want to be able to contact my child in the event there's an emergency going on?
And so when you talk about school shooters, most officers that are experts in this field, I spent a lot of time talking to them, would say, we would suggest that the last thing you want is probably a kid on their phone during a school shooting. Yesterday in testimony, we had a lot of people talk about, even from a parental perspective, that, as much of it's an emotional issue that you want your kid and immediately to talk to them, when you think about a school shooter, as horrible as it is, when 37th graders are on the phone calling 911, videotaping, they're creating noise, which is a target for the shooter. And so I think that we just have to be mindful of how we address this, because it is important. I'm encouraged that we have another really big priority bill that addresses school shooting. My bill is more about phones being up and away, but there's another piece of legislation that is about schools adopting policies so that next time, if there's a school shooter, we have a plan and process in place.
Is there a state funding component to this?
Yes, so we have been really mindful. It is very important to me to not have unfunded mandates. I mean, I live in a rural part of Texas, and so there's a lot of issues that, bills are passed and they're not funded, and it's not fair to put that burden on our school districts. And so I've been working really closely with Chair of Appropriations to be sure that, if we need to allot for some funding, it will be there, to be sure if schools want the option to purchase a pouch, that there's some funding provided for them to do that. Because again, this is about allowing school districts to adopt the policy that they see fit for the phones to be up and away. Texas is so diverse. I mean, so diverse. I represent a rural district, but when you look at your urban areas, there's thousands of kids that attend school versus mine maybe a few hundred. And so there will be funding provided if we see that there's a need, to be sure that we do support these school districts. And it's really important that we do keep that a priority.
My one word is not one word, Greg. Of course, I never follow the rules. My phrase is do not disturb. What's your word?
All right, Stephen, I'm going to go with obvious.
All right, the Fox X Trail will be back, and we'll be joined by Rice University political scientist Mark Jones. All right, we are back, and we're joined by our friend Mark Jones from Rice University. Greg, you're first up at bat. Bipartisan is not the flavor of the session, not at least in my eyes, but this bill has bipartisan support. You have Democrats like James Tellerico and others who support it. Does that shock you?
Stephen, unlike most legislation in Austin, this to me is a slam dunk, no-brainer, obvious decision that's long overdue. First, the science is definitive. Access to cell phones in the classroom is incredibly distracting and inhibits both the ability of instructors to teach and the ability of distracted students to learn. Now, in an era of flat and declining student achievement, nothing that inhibits attention in the classroom should be tolerated. To do so marginalizes the effort of teachers, not to mention the efficacy of the tax dollars we all invest to educate. The argument that students need to notify parents in a crisis is specious at best. I don't know about you, but I want my kids following instructions and making their escape, not calling me on a cell in terror to make a rescue I am almost certainly not in position to execute. Steve, if this bill makes it to the House floor, and I'm guessing it will, I'm eager to see who defends access to Snapchat and TikTok during algebra.
That's true. That's true. I mean, we were talking off air about, cell phones just came into the picture when I was in high school. I'm not even going to talk about what rotary devices were going on when you guys were in school. Mark, this is a bipartisan bill, but do you think it will face opposition if it becomes law?
I don't think it's going to face really any opposition in the House, on the House floor, and it will pass without trouble. Now, we are a state of 31 million, so it's always possible that one or two parents decide to file suit against it. I don't think it being getting much in the way of reception among any judges. So this is legislation I think they'll have no trouble passing and going into force. I think the only issue is one thing that Representative Fairley brought up, and that is the finances behind it. The different types of pouches that are used are not completely inexpensive. And so there is going to be a financial component that the state is going to have to essentially cover if all school districts are going to be able to implement this and implement it in a rigorous manner.
Right, that could, because we have school districts up here in North Texas, some use the pouch, some just has a penalty system if you bring your phone out. So that'll be interesting to see. Greg, this is one thing that you called a no-brainer, but there are other things that are making their way through the legislature when it comes to education in schools, things like possibly having a period for prayer in schools, things like having the 10 Commandments posted in every classroom. For the majority party saying that they are the party of, I guess, freedoms or personal beliefs, is this too much government in schools?
Stephen, as you pointed out earlier, Professor Jones and I grew up in an era when the Establishment Clause of the Constitution was observed pretty strictly, and religion, specifically Christianity, was limited in the public school setting to maybe a campus Christmas tree and recitation of the Lord's Prayer before a football game. Times and interpretations have clearly changed, with conservative forces pushing the constitutional envelope hard to integrate faith components into public school education. Measures like voluntary prayer time and display of the 10 Commandments will be criticized as coercive and challenged before a Supreme Court currently dominated by conservatives. I think what needs more emphasis in these discussions is local control, letting a community make these calls one way or the other. Even then, some folks are certain to be unhappy and certain to allege a tyranny of the majority against the minority. Ultimately, universal school choice could play a factor, with the aggrieved on both sides of these issues presented with options to escape standards they find objectionable. Stay with us after the break. We will go one-on-one with Senator Ted Cruz. Welcome back. For the Lone Star State's junior United States Senator, these are truly satisfying times. With Donald Trump in the White House, Republican majorities in both chambers, a fresh double-digit re-election win under his belt, and a powerful chairmanship of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee to boot, The 54-year-old Houstonian is delighted by both the turn of political events and the prospect of substantial change. We talked one-on-one with Senator Ted Cruz about Ukraine, border security, and the president's controversial deployment of tariffs. Clearly, President Trump is trying to broker peace.
Yes.
Should Texans support what he's trying to do, even if it means territorial concessions for the Ukrainian people?
The war with Ukraine should never have happened. It happened because of Joe Biden's weakness. Listen, when you have a commander-in-chief who is weak and feckless, it encourages our enemies. You look at Joe Biden when he withdrew from Afghanistan, that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. The day it happened, I said publicly, this increases the chances that Russia invades Ukraine tenfold. Because Putin is looking at Biden and saying, that guy ain't nothing. Now, what do we do now? I agree with President Trump. It's time for this to be over. I want it to end, and I want it to be a clear and unequivocal loss for Russia and loss for Putin. I think that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a clear loss. And by the way, I think one of the real benefits we're going to get out of this is the president signing an agreement with Ukraine. They have vast critical minerals and resources, and I think we're going to see American investment that's going to benefit America and hopefully repay America for the billions of dollars that went in to defend Ukraine. At the end of the day, this was a losing proposition for Russia. They've lost massive amounts of manpower and materiel, and they haven't achieved their goal, which is conquering Ukraine.
Hey, look, back on the campaign trail, you predicted if Donald Trump won, Republicans and a new commander-in-chief would have control of the border within 3 months.
Yep.
It's happened quicker than that.
It has been even faster. We're 2 months into the new administration, and we've seen illegal border crossings drop 98%. It is staggering. You remember a year ago, Joe Biden stood up at the State of the Union and said he couldn't secure the border without new legislation from Congress. And President Trump at his State of the Union just a couple of weeks ago said, look, you didn't need new legislation, you just needed a new president.
I come from Laredo, Texas.
Yeah.
Biggest inland port in the country. Yeah. And so people there are concerned about the impact of tariffs and the policy of reciprocity. Senator, you've been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
Why should Texans not feel anxiety?
The question you ask is the single most frequent question I get from business leaders in Texas. And my response, I said, listen, we know that President Trump uses tariffs for two different reasons. One, he uses them as leverage to incentivize conduct by other nations that's in America's interest. And the clearest example is Mexico and Canada. The tariffs he's threatened, he said, if you don't help us secure the border, we're going to impose a 25% tariff. And I'll tell you, he did that the first term, and it worked incredibly well. It resulted in Mexico putting 6,000 troops on their southern border. It resulted in the Remain in Mexico agreement, and it produced the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. So we've seen it work. Here, I am absolutely supportive of the objective of securing the border and using every leverage we can, because that benefits Texas. When we secure the border, Texans, our kids are more safe. Now, that being said, as I noted, we do enormous trade with Mexico. I do not want to see a long-term 25% tariff on trade with Mexico. That would hurt Texas. They would hurt farmers and ranchers and small businesses and manufacturers. So my hope is that the tariff will be threatened, it will incentivize action, and not go into effect. I believe China is the greatest geopolitical threat facing the United States for the next 100 years. And the more we can delink our economy from China, the more we can bring manufacturing home, bring it back, onshore it or nearshore it, the better we are.
Senator Ted Cruz, clearly optimistic. Stephen, while Cruz has always been a free trader, he appeared to say he's willing to back Trump tariff policy as long as it doesn't do substantial damage to the Texas economy. Agree, disagree?
I mean, yeah, and that's a convenient stance. And I say convenient because Senator Cruz is right. Donald Trump, the president, he uses the tariffs as a negotiation tactic. But the question is, will that get old? You know, it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. So will it get old in countries, some, decide to put their foot down and not fold in the final hours of his tariff threat? So yeah, any senator, any lawmakers are going to support something that's not impacting their constituents. But if it does impact Texans, if it does impact our farmers and agriculture and raises prices at the grocery store for Texans, then I think the senator will stop touting that. But for right now, it's working. I just wonder how long will this tariff threat be on again, off again, and other countries actually still are threatened by it.
All right, Dr. Mark Jones, you heard what the senator said about the president's push for peace in Ukraine. Is it a signal to Zelensky that even the most ardent Russia hawks in the Senate want a deal with Putin, even if it means giving Ukraine giving up territory?
Well, yeah, I think we're in a situation with the election of President Trump that there's an opportunity for a reset. Right now, the Russia-Ukraine war is at a stalemate. And I think one thing that we see a lack of support for in the United States is a continuing blank check for Ukraine with really no end in sight. And so we have an opportunity now to bring both Putin and Zelensky to the bargaining table and come out with a solution where both sides lose, both sides win, and that's the nature of a compromise. But we can end this conflict and, from the United States perspective, stop sending billions of dollars and focus spending that money at home where it's sorely needed.
All right, Stephen, Cruz sees the full stop already achieved on most illegal immigration as the clearest win for Republicans and the president thus far. Now, if you're a Democrat, is there any response? I mean, they seem collectively gobsmacked.
Yeah, Democrats are still scrambling, to be completely honest, and some of them are starting to get a taste of what Republicans have been getting in some of these town halls, pushback from their own constituents, saying that Democrats need to get a backbone and get one singular issue or get at least in line on some topics. And so, yeah, the border is something that the Republicans are going to tout. It's something they're going to say, look what we did in the first 90 days, 3 months, 6 months, what have you. Democrats will have to find a way to strategize to say, okay, let's really look at the numbers that happened in the first 6 months under President Trump and how many people actually were deported under President Biden. If those numbers are close, they need to really talk that up to say nothing's really changing. They are just having a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of flashy videos and interesting TikToks.
Mark, sort of the same question. What, if anything, can Democrats do to mitigate the damage done by their open door immigration policy and pretty much abject failure on border security, other than, I guess, change the subject?
Well, certainly changing the subject is probably the best strategy. It's a losing issue now, in part because Democrats were caught flat-footed and that they were their main message was that it can't be resolved without legislation. And as was mentioned by Senator Cruz, President Trump ended at least the crisis part of people coming across the border in a matter of months. There's still the matter of individuals in the United States and the deportation. Democrats do have an opportunity there to essentially focus on any of the negative ramifications of people with American spouses and children being deported without due process. But it's a slippery slope because you really don't want to be on the side of trying to protect the rights of Venezuelan gang members, which in some ways is what the Democratic Party is doing when they're criticizing the deportation of Venezuelans tied to the criminal gang Tren de Aragua in the recent weeks. But overall, I think there is an opportunity, if the Trump administration deepens its deportation efforts, to focus on some of the human costs of people who have strong ties in the community who are being deported without due process. But that's not likely to be a winning issue, but it's at least one where they can fight back a little bit.
Okay, guys, when we come back, we've got issues. We'll see you in a second. All right, this is a segment we like to call We've Got Issues. It's when we kind of talk about what really grinds my gears. Mine is messaging. Now, I understand politics are politics, but the messaging coming out of the White House is a bit misleading, at least from what this journalist knows. In reference to the U.S. Department of Education, the actions by the White House has been to basically dismantle or shrink the Department of Education. The White House and the president is saying that it's a waste of money in some senses, and they need to give control back to the states. The thing is, and they're citing failing test scores in our country, having low grades compared to other countries. The thing is, states do control education. I mean, the people who are teaching the students are the people in the states, not the Department of Education. But that's my issue. Greg, what's your issue?
All right, I'm more fascinated by this. My issue is the barrage of legislation literally blasted out of the Texas Senate this week, Gatling gun style. Bill after bill after bill, much of it straight out of the GOP state platform, as in a ban on drag time story hour, as in placement of the 10 Commandments in public schools, as in officially setting aside time for students to pray, as in prohibiting sale of land to non-citizens from adversarial nations, as in banning sale of THC products, as in outlawing books deemed inappropriate from school libraries. And there were others, so without discussing the merits of any of these proposed laws, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has really put the pressure on Republican leadership in the House. We'll leave it there.
All right. That's all the time we have. To see this episode or any of our past ones, go to our station's YouTube channels and keep the conversation going by communicating with us on social media.
We guarantee another hot political topic next week. In the meantime, don't forget to let us know what you think the issue is.